What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of America Trends with John Kropsic and Larry Rifkin. And John, we're going to be going to the dogs today.
Yeah, this is a very interesting episode.
I think it is, because we're looking to save Simon. And Simon is a dog located right here as we are in the state of Connecticut. And there's a heartbroken family that hasn't really been able to bring Simon back home because of something that Simon allegedly did. And the larger story that this raises in America today as it relates to trends is how important are dogs in the scheme of our lives, and what role should they have and be placed in as it relates to their standing before the law?
Yeah, they're parts of the family, and then again, they're also a dog. So you're right. This is a question that needs to be answered.
Well, in the pecking order of things, obviously, human beings and our safety have to stand apart and ahead of a dog. I had a situation here in Connecticut that belies some of the things you're going to hear today, because we had a dog on our street, John, who was rather aggressive, shall we say, and this dog actually attacked one of my neighbors. And I was going up the street subsequently without my dog at the time, though this dog had followed my dog and me back to my home a couple of times. But I saw this dog again unleashed and looking at me with great desire, let's put it that way, from a distance on a neighbor's lawn. And I couldn't understand this, John, because there was a restraining order against this dog. And I had nothing on me. I had no mace. I had no club. I had really nothing to defend myself, except that we have underground utilities on my street. And luckily, I was right near a box with all the bundles of wires. And so I jumped up on it. So then I was kind of tall and aggressive, and the dog couldn't get me. And then the neighbor came down, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And we ended up at a hearing. The Department of Agriculture in Connecticut runs these things. And we had to defend ourselves. It was almost as if we were on trial. And they did a video of the dog, made it look like Lassie, John.
Yeah, well, that's ridiculous, because people do have to have responsibility for their pets. You own a pet, you should be responsible for that pet. And if you're not, then, then I can see why a dog would be taken away, because, you got to be responsible. I mean, they can hurt people if they're not.
Yeah, I was talking to the neighbor who was bit by this dog, and he still has nightmares about it, and he's got the scars to prove that this was really a pretty terrible incident. Well, in this case, the dog was actually on its own property, defending its own territory, and then a neighbor came in. Well, we're going to let Dr. David Young, Simon's dad, tell you about this incident, but it occurred in August 2017 with a teenage neighbor. And then we're going to do something, John, that we don't do very often, where we take a personal story and we try to extrapolate from that where we are as it relates to the law and mores in our society. But one thing we must say, John, dogs are such an important part of our lives. I mean, people do some crazy things for their dogs.
They do. We were on a remote one time, and the person that ran the store was telling me that they buy diamond necklaces for their dogs, and I mean, people get really crazy.
Well, do they actually buy the champagne, and do they give it to the dog and give them the necklace? And is it a beautiful evening, John?
No, I didn't go that far.
Well,
That's for another podcast.
That's almost too much information. But think about it, John. People are really giving their entire legacy and their fortune to their dogs.
Yeah.
Does that make a whole lot of sense either?
No, I don't understand that, but I guess maybe that's all they have, or maybe that's all they've ever loved. I don't know. I can't explain
Well,
it.
wasn't it Leona Helmsley who left everything to a dog?
Yeah, I think they fought that. Though.
I think they might have. The rest of the family, hey, wait a minute here. I'll give them a few treats and some good veterinary care, but after that, no, but really, you do want to leave it so that the dog is cared for when you
Right,
die.
that would make sense.
Yeah, but I don't know that a dog could make great decisions about like millions of dollars. That I don't know. But to help us understand some of the issues in our society today is attorney Richard Rosenthal. And John, he must really be into this practice of law because he calls himself the dog lawyer.
Yeah, he's gone to the dog.
Do you think his clients pay him well? I don't
I wonder
know.
if he's got a lot of dog clients.
But he's thedoglawyer.com, and he's dedicated to the protection of animals and their legal rights. So we're going to get into a personal story. And by the way, we learned something in this podcast about our own state that is rather disturbing about the tendencies, even though in the case that I mentioned on my street, there were a lot of allowances for this dog, but evidently Connecticut's pretty tough when it comes to someone not protecting their neighbors and the safety of their neighbors.
Yeah, well, it should be. I mean, people got to be. I mean, it's like owning a gun. You own a dog, you got to be responsible for that dog. And I agree with that. I think that's important.
Well, here we are. We're going to save Simon first and talk to Dr. David Young, and then attorney Richard Rosenthal today on America Trends.
With us on the line on America Trends is Dr. David Young. And Dr. Young, you've got a story that's, really close to home, right in your own yard about your dog, and we all love our dogs. But tell us what's happened to yours as a result of an incident that occurred in your yard.
Well, Simon was in our yard with his dog sitter, who's known him for years, playing in the yard. And suddenly the dog sitter noticed that there was somebody in the yard with a large stick. It turned out to be a lacrosse stick. Startled them both. And so Simon, all of a sudden took off and nipped the kid on the ankle and the shoe just to kind of warn him off. And the kid instead raised the stick instead of retreating. And so Simon bit him in the leg, and then the kid ran off. This was a 13-year-old, I believe, 12 or 13.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got four brothers, so he knows better. And it turned out that the fence had been cut as well in order to gain access. So at the time, the sitter didn't know her rights. And the animal control officer said, well, why don't we're going to take the dog down to quarantine. And she reassured the sitter and us that Simon did no wrong. As he was in his own yard, he's protected by Connecticut statute 22-357 that basically states that, a dog is protected in his own yard in the event of trespass, threatening behavior, and destruction of property. The first 9 pages of the police report basically is the animal control officer essentially defending Simon, saying, he did no wrong, he's going to go back home. This all the while the neighbors are calling for his destruction. Again, in the police report, the day of the incident, the neighbors are heard and quoted in the police report as saying, kill the dog, kill the dog. So their intent was very clear.
Now, was there any other history with Simon with other dogs or children or adults in the neighborhood?
No, none whatsoever. There was one event with another dog, and again, that was provoked. And that was with somebody up the street who was walking his dog, and I believe the dog came into the property. This was unwitnessed, but I've seen that same neighbor berating and yelling at Simon when Simon was minding his own business in our yard. We have an electric fence. We have two fences. We have a wood fence, the wire fence that was cut, and an electric fence. So Simon never goes outside that fence without us. So there was no prior history. He's never hurt another never touched another person. In fact, he loves people. His history is, we have people in our yard all the time. The person that cuts our yard, construction people come in our yard, and he just wants to help.
Yeah. No, I know that kind of dog. But why is it, with the statute that you referenced in the state of Connecticut, why is it that now town officials have sentenced Simon to death?
Well, because the neighbors apparently had some political pull in the town. That's the problem. I have police reports from multiple other cases in the town of Guilford of dogs and dog bites, even dog bites off property and off leash with people who have had prior histories. In fact, I have one of those police reports, extensive prior histories, yet they quarantined that dog on the person's property, their own property, which Simon could have been, or gave them a choice. You can do it here, or you can do it at the vet's office. Just quarantine them for 14 days and you're done. Those dogs were not put down. Even dogs with prior histories. Or recently there was one with a dog that was unprovoked in his yard with a kid, and bit the kid. He was quarantined for 14 days. They gave that family a choice. They said, well, why don't you, in fact, in that police report, the language is, okay, we can quarantine the dog at our facility at the police station to give it a rest from the children. So it's like, why is that case so different? And I think what makes this case so different is a neighbor with political pull. They were very intent on having Simon killed, and so the town made a decision based on that. They had a meeting that was a private meeting with town attorney, with the ACO, with the chief of police, and the first selectman. This was a closed meeting.
Now, is that even legal under Freedom of Information statutes in your state?
The open meetings law is violated right there. And so they had this meeting, and so the first 9 pages of the police report is Simon did no wrong, he's protected by the law, he was on his own property, and then all of a sudden there's this meeting that is noted on August 14th that I was not invited to, so I wasn't at this meeting. During that meeting, it was decided to put Simon down, and so, my wife and I, went down to the police station. We were going to say we're going to put up, in fact, we're telling them we're going to put up a larger fence to keep intruders out and keep our family safe and Simon safe. And they said, well, don't bother because we're going to put Simon down. And the police chiefs told my wife and I, well, and you should not fight this because you don't want to bring trouble. So basically, he threatened us.
And I know you have hired an attorney. You're appealing the town's decision, and you've got about 8,000 signatures in support of Simon.
Right.
And with all of that, are you really on the short end of this fight as you see it, or do you think that this can be overturned? What's the process?
Well, the process is ultimately it is the chief, the CEO of the town that has the authority to issue this and overturn it. And the current first selectman sent me a letter basically saying, I do not believe I have the authority to overturn this. So he doesn't even know. But when, in fact, if you look at, even the regs by the Attorney General, basically the town has the authority. As, again, just like any company, the CEO has ultimate authority. They are all working for him.
But isn't there an opportunity, because I was involved in a case myself, and this was not a benign situation. This was a dog who kept coming after our neighbors and me. I ended up having to go on a cable box to defend myself as the dog was supposed to be quarantined and was running at me full speed down the street. So I had a different circumstance altogether. But at the same time, I ended up at a hearing in Connecticut at the State Department of Education or State Office building with the Agriculture Department.
Right. Exactly. And so we did have a mediation, not a hearing, but a mediation. And, again, by law, the town is supposed to appeal. In an appeal, we should have been granted that mediation or even a hearing within 14 days. That did not happen for 6 months. And that was only after the urging of Sean Scanlon, who's our local representative. He wrote the Department of Agriculture a letter saying, at least have a hearing. And so we had a hearing, and the town just did nothing but dig in their heels. The chief of police was there, as was the ACO. They didn't speak a word. They were advised by their attorneys not to say anything. So their attorney basically lied, saying that Simon has an extensive history, which he does not. That's all hearsay. He has no history. And that he's a danger. Well, and the neighbors claim that he's a vicious dog. Well, if he's so vicious, what the hell are you doing in my yard, right? And nor has he had any history. And so, yes, we had a hearing that lasted all of a half an hour, if that, because the town wouldn't hear anything. They wouldn't hear the argument that, heck, he was in his own yard. And you're not supposed to have this private meeting, that you violated the law. They said, no, we're not hearing that. So they wouldn't even talk. So that didn't end well. The next step would be to have a hearing. But, however, the Department of Agriculture, the laws are written in the state of Connecticut such that if the ACO decides that a dog should be put down, the Department of Agriculture says, then so be it.
Now, what
They're
about
understaffed,
Simon?
They're underfunded, and they don't want anything to do with this.
No, believe me, I understand. They lost the transcripts. We went up for 2 days of hearings. I only went 1 day, but they actually lost the transcripts. I mean, this is unbelievable, the ineffectual nature of some of these groups. But with that said, where has Simon been throughout this process?
He's at the lockup, the animal control in Guilford. There.
And do you go to see him every day, or what's the...
I do. I go to see him probably once or twice a week, because they're there limited hours. Mm-hmm. And so I get there because I also have to work for a living.
Yes. Well, what do you think now? I mean, now that you're embroiled in this, you're a physician. You care about your patients. You care about other human beings. But we also care about our animals. I mean, what does this tell you about the way we're treating? I mean, dogs are a part of the family. And, I mean, unless there's a compelling public safety concern, which I'm not certain I've heard in this case, why should that dog be wrenched from its home?
Well, exactly. And the problem with this case is it comes down to a neighbor with a grudge, a neighbor with an agenda, and a neighbor with connections. That is the difference. I have about 4 or 5 other police reports in my possession from the town of Guilford, and none of which even come close to, these dogs were not provoked. These dogs were off their own property. These dogs had other events. They were not put down. The only difference in my case is Simon was on his own property. It's a neighbor with connection. It's an abuse of power. And the town fully knows, again, as well as I do, when you know you made a mistake, you lawyer up. And that's what they did immediately. So why do you think there's an attorney at this initial meeting, this private meeting? Right?
And is the neighbor is the father or mother of the child who was affected?
I think it was their neighbor.
Oh.
Next door to them. It's Amy Sullivan, who used to be on the Board of Ed. They're a very connected family. And so, Simon barked at her once, never hurt her, never came off our property, barked at her once. And, in fact, she went online to defend the Phillies, which is our next door neighbor, and she was eviscerated online. I mean, people just like, you're going to kill everything that scares you?
Well, with all that said, you must have been hearing from people all over the country. I mean, are there many of these types of cases where politics or influence gets involved? And what have you heard from others around the United States about this?
I've heard similar cases. I've heard, a lot of variable cases, but actually, thus far, I have not heard a case that goes as far as this, as far as someone with political connections making things happen. Because most of these cases, and I think, and Richard can probably talk to you more about this, is there's a lot of cases throughout the country that you never hear about. So if my wife and I did not look into this and look at and research our rights, and being told by the chief of police that just let this go quietly, how many of those are gone that you never hear about? I think there are many, and I know there are many. And again, some of the cases that are out there in Connecticut, I know of, these are, dogs that may have come off property or whatever. But I don't know of any in the case where, the dog did nothing wrong. They were on their own property. It's egregious.
And what do you think now about animal rights in general when you begun studying the law? I mean, do you feel that the United States really has a progressive way of looking at our pets? Where do they fall between property and humans? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think I'm learning that pets have no rights. And in my experience, people have no rights on their own property. I've gotten a lot of comments on Simon's page. Oh, I live in Florida and I could have shot the person and got away with it. I doubt that. But, Texas, Florida, they have the what's that law?
The stand your ground.
The stand your ground, yeah. And so I doubt they would have gotten off scot-free if they just shot somebody. However, with that said, the dog was on his own property, and, people are pretty outraged. And what does this tell me is that, beware. Dog owners should beware, because this is very precedent-setting, because if this is allowed to proceed and they do stand their ground and do not back down, this means that anybody can come into your yard and you have no rights. And the ACO can come onto your property and take your dog. That's a violation of my civil rights.
If you're a betting man, I mean, what do you think is going to happen to your dog in your case?
Well, we're going to keep appealing. We're going to stand our ground. I hear, people say, "Oh, I know some of the neighbors. I know the neighbors, and they don't see why Simon can't come back home and with a fence with provisions." But I haven't heard that, right?
Well, what kind of dog are you going to be getting back if you do, after being locked away all these months? I mean, it's got to be so disconcerting. I hate to say it, because certain people are going to say, "Larry, what do you care about the psychology of a dog?" Well, I do. I mean, it's got to change your dog forever.
Yeah, I mean, you would think he's still a goofball, but it's hard to tell. I mean, he's still playful, and he's not. Of course, he has no anger. That's for sure. But I think the lucky thing is dogs have short attention span. So when and if he can come back home, I think he'll fall back into his routine. I mean, his favorite thing is to be used as a pillow.
Yeah.
He's not being abused there. He's just isolated.
Yeah, I understand. Well, listen, I want to thank you for joining us on America Trends, because we really wanted to explore this issue. And, of course, we will be talking to Attorney Richard, the dog lawyer, Rosenthal, in just a moment on the podcast.
Great.
But I thank you very much, Dr. Young, for being with us, and I wish you good luck. We'll follow your case.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I think this sets potentially a very dangerous precedent, and I think everybody should pay attention.
All right. Thanks again for coming by.
Thank you.
Okay.
And now the rest of the story from Attorney Richard, the dog lawyer, Rosenthal.
Attorney Richard, the dog lawyer, Rosenthal, is with us. And, of course, you're representing Simon in the case of Dr. Young, whom we just talked to on America Trends. Tell us, what's your perspective on this story?
I think that it's a complete violation of his civil rights. I guess the best way to explain it is Gandhi said that a measure of society is how they treat their animals. If that's so, Connecticut, and particularly this town, is a third world nation.
And do you think Connecticut is different in kind from other states and other municipalities?
Absolutely. To give you an idea,
Sure.
New York's law requires a hearing be held within no less than 2 and no more than 5 days. The burden of proof, it's before a judge. The burden of proof is by clear and convincing evidence, which is the second highest and also the second lowest standard. And the burden is on the people. And it is clear in the statute that if the person is trespassing or provokes the dog, it is an absolute defense.
So should it be obvious to most officials in Connecticut that this is a wrong that needs to be righted? I mean, do you think that this case will be overturned?
Absolutely. The legislature in 22-358 has already said that provocation because of trespassing or other crime is a defense, is an absolute defense. You cannot bring an action for damages under those circumstances. Unfortunately, Commissioner Ravitsky at the Department of Agriculture is more worried about the efficiency of his killing machine than actually the Constitution or protecting anyone's rights. Their hearing officers, such as Dr. Sherman, who is Connecticut's version of Dr. Mengele, has never met a dog he didn't want to kill. Our problem is that we have a Department of Agriculture that has absolutely no respect for the Constitution or the law. And the only thing they're worried about is the efficiency of their killing machine. And this is particularly evident in the fact that they sent a bill to the legislature for consideration that would allow them to get rid of what little due process was currently in place, so they can kill more quickly and with less paperwork.
In some materials that I got from you, you say that every day dogs are seized and pet owners are forced to defend themselves. So is this something that's going on around the country?
In varying degrees, but no place like it is in Connecticut. Most places do not take a dog, give you 14 days to file an appeal, and then take 8 months to a year and a half to schedule a hearing, hoping that you'll eventually just let them kill the dog without a hearing. In fact, our current advice to everyone is that if your dog is in Connecticut, if your dog is involved in an incident in Connecticut, and you have not been served with either a seizure order or a quarantine order, get the dog out of Connecticut immediately. If they can't seize them, you at least have the ability to negotiate and handle it in a manner that saves the dog's life.
Now, you're the general counsel for the Lexus Project, and you've created and advanced what is called the Cody Trust Standing in over 100 cases in 27 states. Explain that to us.
Okay, the biggest problem in most cases for animals is an issue of who has standing to bring the suit. Who will the court listen to? And many, many animal rights cases have been thrown out because of lack of standing. And the courts always say that in order for there to be standing, the legislature has to create it. It's for the legislature to do, not the courts. Well, the legislature in 49 states and the District of Columbia have created pet trust laws. And by using the various laws in somewhat novel ways, we have created trusts under these laws for the animals, and the trustee now has a legal obligation to fight to keep the animal alive, which gives him standing. And in New York, we've taken it so far as to litigate on behalf of animals in shelters in a number of cases, and the courts have recognized at least in those limited cases, our right to fight for the animal. And every time we've done it, we have saved the animal's life.
Are you suggesting that if I'm the owner of an animal that a community says has violated the norms or the laws or ordinances, that I may not have standing to represent that animal if I don't have?
You will have standing for your own animal.
Mm-hmm.
But a dog that's in a shelter who doesn't have a known owner, or in certain cases, one of the first times we used trust standing was in a case in Texas where the dog had been seized because they charged the owner with animal abuse. The case had dragged on long enough that the shelter was looking to put the dog down. The owner was not the person to bring a suit on behalf of the dog. We used trust standing to go into court. The court appointed us as guardian for the dog. The owner contested, and we won the right to represent the dog as against the owner and the shelter The court turned the dog over to us. The dog's name was Champ. Unfortunately, the shelter hadn't bothered to give the dog any medical care during the time, and the dog came down with distemper while at the shelter. But he spent his last 10 months with a wonderful family, going boating and living the good life, and he died loved. And there was a situation where there was no one else to stand up for the dog but us. And had it not been for trust standing, we would not have been able to.
Now, I know that your goal is to have animals with their own status within property law and make certain that we all understand that they belong in a classification somewhere between property law and child custody. Are we getting closer to that standard?
Well, I don't know that that's actually a completely true statement. We do acknowledge animals are property. We just don't have a way to deal with them otherwise. However, the Non-Human Rights Project, Stephen Wise's group, has written a brilliant brief in the chimp writ of habeas corpus case as to why animals should be declared legal persons. And that doesn't mean human or people. But in much the same sense as a corporation is a legal person who can sue and be sued and has a distinct legal status, notwithstanding the fact that a corporation is something we made up, that eventually the legislatures are going to have to come up with something akin to that. Let me give you some of the problems with the laws as they stand right now. If anyone looks at the dangerous dog law, it says that if a dog without provocation bites someone causing injury, they can be declared dangerous. In most states, Connecticut is an exception. Connecticut basically says if a dog bites someone for any reason, whether provoked or not, the animal control officer, who is generally a high school grad with no specific training in animal behavior, can do anything he wants, and whatever he does is correct. But in any of the states that have actually become civilized, within the dangerous dog law, they list exceptions. The exceptions are usually if the dog is provoked, if someone is committing a crime on the property, if they're threatening the dog, if they've hurt the dog, if they're hurting the dog or previously hurt the dog. Now, when you look at it, and all of these make sense, except for one little point that most people don't actually think about. Every one of the exceptions deals solely with what the dog is thinking, what is going on in the dog's mind. To now suggest, well, they're just property and there are no rights. Dogs nowadays have the right, and the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit has said in so many words, animals have the right to be fed, to medical care, to good food, air, and water. They have the right to be free from abuse. They have the right to become beneficiaries of trusts under the pet trust laws. They have the right to have orders of protection issued and enforced in their own, naming them specifically. Think about all the rights they do have already. Then think about if you were to give these same rights to, say, your car, how ridiculous it is. And the only way you can justify it is when you get back to the fact these are living, sentient beings.
Absolutely, and they're a part of the family. Well, we are going to have to wrap up this conversation. We may want to get back to the dog lawyer, Richard Rosenthal, representing Simon. If people do want to get in touch with you, how can they?
My website is thedoglawyer.com. They can also find me on Facebook. TheLexusProject.org is the Lexus Project's website. And if you Google the dog lawyer, it generally gets to me.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much, Attorney Rosenthal, for being with us today on America Trends.
Thank you, and any time.